Marsha, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for asking me to be here. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, and I always enjoy, having folks from all different unique backgrounds and how they got to where they are today. It wasn't just a, stroke of luck, and it wasn't just, it happened overnight, right? There's all these different challenges and obstacles people had to overcome. And I thought we'd start our conversation, if it's okay, kind of doing some research prior. It seems like, if I put in quotations, fact check me on this, but you're in the business of helping people, right? You love
Yeah,
helping people. And I'm kind of
absolutely.
in a similar light. One of the reasons I want to talk to you and with the whole just get started mission, but it comes from a place of struggle and fear and anxiety and all these things I grew up with and I had in early adulthood. So I'm curious if you could start, because I'm assuming there's something that's happened to you, or maybe multiple things, of why you decide to help people, because maybe something happened in your life that
Yeah.
wasn't as advantageous or helpful to you. So can you start there? Maybe just give us a little kind of some bread
Yeah.
on the journey.
Yeah, for sure. I when I think, sort of what was the turning point of my life, and this wasn't the first time that I had really, dug deep for something that I wanted to do or something that I needed to do, but it was the first time where I really felt like, the universe was kind of pointing me down a different pathway. And so basically what happened was I went to law school in my late 20s as a single mom, and just lots of things going on with a pretty chaotic relationship with my college boyfriend, who has been my husband, my best drinking buddy, and all that stuff. On the rocks. So I go to law school thinking, I've got to figure out something that I can do that I like to do. And I've always been a pretty good communicator, and I've always liked debate competitions and stuff like that. I like to have logical conversations. And I really picked well. I enjoyed being a lawyer. I was like a little, like small town trial lawyer. I started first as a prosecutor. But the main thing that was happening during those 10 years was I was really struggling with alcoholism. And when I often say this, but I think people can really relate to it, especially people that are pretty driven and high functioning. When we make up our mind to do something, and we make up our heart to get in line with our mind that we're going to take the action that's necessary, we can achieve goals like, pretty much across the board. That's, the thought, the action, the success. But when it came to making up my mind to stop drinking, I could not pull it off. I couldn't do it. Recovery literature says powerless. But what ended up happening was I had been in trouble, quote unquote, with the Bar Association in North Carolina and Georgia for so long that, in and out of treatment, in and out of detox and stuff like that. And just really embarrassed. People would say, like, Marsha, you have everything going for you. Like, why do you keep doing that? And now I know that that's like asking someone, why do you have cancer? Or why do you have diabetes? It just is. But I didn't understand it at that time. But because I'd struggled for so long, both bar associations came together, and I had to sign a 5-year basically suspension / resignation of my license. And so I had 5 years in front of me from the time I got sober and had no idea what to do, because I thought all I know how to do is practice law. But I was offered a job working in a recovery center, and I'd say probably maybe 60 to 90 days into that position, I knew for sure that this was what I was meant to do, that this was what I was put on this earth to do, because I was able to, not only help people, but help people with the very thing, being the alcoholism and the addiction, that I could not overcome on my own. So it was just like, sort of the perfect storm, if you will, that got me excited and no longer shameful about the alcoholism, able to, speak about it this way. I remember one time I live in Texas now, and I did sort of a recovery talk for, I think it was like Recovery Day on the steps of the Capitol down in Austin. And I had people calling me up like, I cannot believe that you went on YouTube and said, I'm Marsha Stone and I'm an alcoholic. And I was like, well, first of all, you don't just go on YouTube. I didn't mean for that to happen, but I don't care that it did. I'm glad that it did, because if I can be the face or a face of recovery from something that was killing me, not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually, and, taking away everything I loved in my life. But, I'm very grateful that it was kind of, my struggle was pretty out loud because I lived in small towns and everybody kind of knew. And then the bar association who said, there's something magical that happened, at least for me, that I don't have any secrets anymore. You want to talk about drugs, let's talk about drugs. You want to talk about alcohol, let's talk about alcohol. You want to talk about recovery, you want to talk about treatment business, because something very freeing happened within me. And it just like helped me to let loose of all the shackles of shame and regret that I had, and to really just go forward with a very clear mission of what my life was going to be like. Now that's taken different turns from, professional perspective. But when I had that clarity, it was a gift. Honestly, I felt like it was a gift from the universe, because a lot of people never get to that point, and they, hide out this problem that is, sort of in our culture, at least, sort of, looked at sometimes as a moral failure. Yeah. And, I just try to bring it back to, this is a brain disease. Do you want to talk about neurotransmitters? Because I actually went back to school and got my LCDC, which after law school, I was like, I'm never going back to school. But I've learned you never say never.
Where does the, so fact check me on this, because I don't know, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but a lot of things, at least I've heard, is it stems like in terms of different, I say generational, I guess, but if your parents or family members were alcoholics, there's a good chance you could be. Is that accurate? Is there anything?
That is. No, that is. And there's a huge spectrum, and there's lots of, difference of opinions. My opinion, if you ask me the question, like what causes alcoholism, it is typically a combination of genetics and some type of pain or trauma, usually in early childhood. Not always, but that's, some type of trauma, some type of, hardship in terms of your living conditions combined with genetics. Now, that's not to say that everyone who has a genetic propensity and has had a hard, life at some point becomes alcoholic, because they don't, right? There's got to be this, you've got to drink enough so that you cross this line where, they say like, you can't turn a pickle back into a cucumber, right? So, and that line is different for everyone. And to me, the line that you cross is not nearly as important as the surrender that has to happen within yourself to be able to get to the other side of it. And interestingly enough, we'll talk about it, I'm sure, but the platform company that I'm starting now is called Foundation Stone. And the reason I chose that is not because my last name is Stone, although, the PR people were like, that's great. But it wasn't that. It was in our recovery literature, it says, helping others is the foundation stone of my recovery. And that is, in a sentence, who I am and what I believe in. So I was happy to call this new business Foundation Stone family of programs.
Well, and I just want to touch on one more thing, because, and just again, just more for learning, I guess, for myself, when we talk about alcoholism, is that I guess a grab bag could be anything from addiction? Because obviously alcohol in essence, right? You think of whiskey or beer or whatever, that's man-made. So it's something, it's some addiction thing that almost gives you a little bit, almost numbs you. Is that, because it could be drugs, it could be something else, right?
Absolutely. And I call, and that's very astute what you're saying. I call it sort of the ism, because I might, be alcoholic. You might be addicted to shopping. Someone else may be addicted to relationships or food or exercise or cocaine or heroin or fentanyl. To me, this is what I've always said, the substance is a symptom, right? The substance doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is that somewhere along the line, our life was painful to the point that we needed sort of an anesthetic. And through genetics or, repeated introduction of some substance into our body, this sort of allergy starts to happen. And unless you have experienced that, it just sounds it sounds crazy. And I understand it sounds crazy, but like, I've had the experience where I'm drinking and it almost seems like the more I drink, the thirstier I am. And unless you have sort of the body that has that strange reaction to, like we said, not only alcohol, drugs, because it's dopamine, right? I mean, it makes you feel good, even just for a little time. And it feels in a way like, you know, that consequences are going to happen at some point. You realize like, this is not going to be different. It's going to be the same and it's going to be bad. But it's almost like that sort of prehistoric part of your brain would trade in possible consequences for the 5 minutes of relief, you know, from, you know, I mean, like, I think most people have had the experience, like, you know, you drink a beer and then go to a party and all of a sudden you can talk to the cute boy or dance or whatever, right? It sort of lets that inhibition down. But when you do that over and over and over again, it gets to the point where the alcohol or whatever substance or whatever behavior isn't working anymore. And you keep trying to do more and more and more with more and more severe consequences. And then we get to the point like, I can't imagine life with alcohol anymore, and I can't imagine life without alcohol anymore.
Yeah.
And that's when we're sort of at the turning point. Like, what do you want to do? Because we know for sure this ism will end up, you know, in jails, institutions, or, you know, death. And that's the hard part, right? Because I never want to, you know, sugarcoat or, you know, paint with pastels, because getting into recovery is by far the hardest thing I've ever done. And maintaining my recovery is not as hard, but certainly takes effort. But at the same time, you know, the first question that you asked me, it turned my world upside down in the most positive way. And so I'm one of those like annoying people that says, you know, I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to be an alcoholic.
Yeah. Now, you obviously you've been sober for
15 years.
15 years. Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. Now,
Yeah.
you said something interesting, and maybe just the way you worded it, I'm picking up on is, do you still consider yourself in recovery?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I do, because I know for sure that if I were to try to start drinking socially today, it might work for a little bit, but the way my brain chemistry is, the way my body chemistry is, it literally is like I'm allergic to it. And one of the reasons that I continue to say I'm an alcoholic and I'm an alcoholic in recovery, and some people don't like to say that. But again, for me, I don't feel any shame about it. And it's something that when you say it, it kind of gets people's attention. Like I can tell it kind of got your attention, like, whoa, you know. But I'm literally grateful. It turned my life in a direction where I have an opportunity to help people every single day. And, you know, that's my purpose. That's what, you know, lights my heart on fire. And, you know, and the other part about it too is, Brian, is I have to be honest, right? I have to be rigorously honest. And the honest truth is I know that I will never be able to drink like a normal person.
When you got sober, was that you know, I've had folks say, I quit cold turkey and, you know, never had a drink. This is kind of a two-parter, so kind of stick with me because I think you can kind of weave the answers together. Is how did you get sober? Mm-hmm. And based on what you're doing with Foundation Stone and some of the other things you've done, how has, I guess, getting sober or getting in recovery now different than 15 years ago? What's changed? What's improved, I guess?
That is a really good question. I will say, yes, I got sober 15 years ago. And the reason that I got sober was because I didn't stop trying to get sober. It took me about 6 years, and I was in and out of treatment, like I was saying. And, you know, my children certainly suffered a lot during that period of time. But I knew I wanted it. I knew I needed it. And I just, I mean, it's such an annoying thing when you hear it, but people will say like, you know, stick around until the miracle happens. The miracle being like, you know, you finally cross that turning point. But I don't know. I guess I was just so hard-headed that I just was not going to accept that I couldn't do this. And I got to the point where I realized I couldn't do it on my own. So then I started to listen to, you know, direction from therapists and doctors and sponsors and advisors and, you know, spiritual guides and all kinds of stuff like that. Because basically the way it worked for me is through, you know, 12-step programs And, the traditions prevent me from saying, exactly which program I belong to. I'm happy to have a private conversation if anyone wants to know that, but I try to honor, the traditions of this amazing program. And really, I think the most important thing that happened was I surrendered that I couldn't do it on my own. And I just stopped questioning that advice and just started taking the advice really from a place of humility, not a place necessarily of defeat, although I guess I was defeated. But it just occurred to me that as a lawyer, if you have a problem, you go into your lawyer's office and you tell them your problem and pay them a bunch of money, and then they give you direction and you take that direction and your problem is hopefully resolved. But with alcoholism, I would have those same kind of conversations with therapists and doctors, et cetera. But for some reason, my mind liked to tell me that my case was a little bit different, or they didn't quite understand. So this is the reason I can't go to long-term treatment, because I have kids, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I have a business. Those are all just excuses. And when, those parts of my life had suffered the consequences of my continuing down that road of not in recovery, I was able to finally just surrender and just take direction. And I went to long-term gender specific treatment, which, interestingly is the first program that I built when I got into this industry. And just took a lot of my experiences and created an atmosphere that worked for me when I was struggling. And ever since then, I've been able to become interested in different types of demographic groups that need a different type of treatment. And I've just become really a sort of a student of what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another person. And just to really be an open book about that and continuing to learn. I will say the other thing you asked me about what's different. So people talk about recovery a lot more now, right? Back then it was still kind of a, at your family dinners and stuff like that. And I also remember that when I was getting in trouble, and I use that term on purpose with the bar associations, I can see now that yes, they were trying to help, but it felt very punitive at the time. And now these days, I'm not saying that, our society gets it right, but I think that there are a lot more people that have opened their eyes to, you can't necessarily punish the alcoholism out of somebody, only through really, repair, recovery, those type of things to address the illness. But I think that people, especially professionals, encounter less punitive boards now. And boards that are more educated and want to, rehabilitate instead of, dismiss.
Well, isn't it? And this may be a side alleyway to take, but you see this a lot. I think with the prison system is we put people in prison of,
Yeah.
Okay, maybe it's for drugs or whatever, but the reality, it's probably treatment, it's help they need. It's not being behind bars, right?
Right.
And that's
right. I've heard all kinds of different statistics. And there's so many statistics about that, and that kind of gets us into a whole nother conversation about, if I wasn't white, if I wasn't a female, would I have gotten prosecuted for the things that I did? Would I be in jail instead of sitting here in my home, on a podcast talking about all the businesses that I've started to help people? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but I will say that I do think that race and gender play a large role in some of the statistics that we hear about people going to prison for long periods of time for drug offenses and nonviolent crimes.
You said something earlier too. I want to make sure I touch on, and this may be, I don't know what the term would be. This may be connected, maybe not, but you mentioned about, genetics being a part of this. I would assume part of that is personality. So if you're someone that's very ambitious, you're someone that, I'll use the word controlling, or you want to control the situation, you want to have the answer.
Yeah.
That isn't going to help, because to your point, right, is you're like, I can solve this myself. Like I could figure it out. I don't need help. Is that part of it as well? Like, is that why
It
some
certainly,
people
I
have
mean, it
a
certainly was
challenge?
part of my experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know if that's what you all see with some of the different
Yeah. I mean, I think,
stuff. Is that part of it?
I've heard that like lawyers and doctors and airline pilots are the hardest people to be able to treat to get into recovery. I mean, I don't have any specific statistics about that, so I can only speak about myself. But I think that this sort of type A driven personality, we don't say it out loud because it's rude, but inside we all kind of think like I'm the smartest person in the room, and when you're thinking that and your experience with your life is not lining up to that, it's like, are you going to admit that you don't know everything about this and you need help, or are you just going to keep on to the bitter end? And I mean, I fought it for a long time. I fought it for a long time, and I tried all kinds of things: yoga, hiking, church, being a vegetarian. I mean, there's so much written out there and different, like little rabbit holes that you can kind of go down that I don't know. For me, it just got more and more obvious over time that I wasn't going to be able to do this on my own. And having the humility to admit that, in my experience, is not like sort of organic or born within me. It was just a result of sort of facts.
Well, you mentioned it took many years to kind of get over that hump and get that humility. Was there anything specific you remember? Like maybe it was a certain session, maybe it was certain questions that you never went down that path. Like, was there anything specific of why it took that long? Like when it actually clicked? Do you
Yeah.
remember why it clicked?
I do. And it really all has to do with being willing to take direction. I say this lots of times. Recovery, when you boil it all down, it's being willing to take directions for your best interest that don't originate from your own mind, right? And so I remember this turning point where I'd been in the treatment center, the last one that I went to, knock on wood, only the last one I'll ever go to, about 2 weeks. And I started getting that like real antsy feeling that I didn't want to be there. All the excuses kept coming back in my mind. And, you can convince yourself that leaving is the best thing that you should do. But I set an appointment, or maybe I just walked in her office, I don't remember, but to the director of the program where I was. And I was telling her kind of, what's going on, and I want to leave, and, I'm scared and all this stuff. And she sort of challenged me about doing something that I had never done before, which was taking directions, like period. No argument, no negotiation, none of that. And I thought about it for a second, and I really had a lot of respect for this woman. And, like I said, my back was up against the wall. And I said to her, okay, if I stay in this treatment center as long as you tell me to, I do every assignment you give me. I don't bend the rules. I mind the curfew, and I stay here until you guys say I'm well and I'm ready to go. If I do all those things and I drink again despite of that, then it's your fault. And I'm going to move to the Virgin Islands and I'm going to drink like forever. And she literally stuck out her hand and said, I'll take that deal. And for me, that was almost like an outward manifestation of the surrender that was happening within my heart. But I needed someone to reassure me just like one little bitty last time that if I would take direction, I could have recovery, because if you've been in and out of treatment for so long, you start to sort of internalize this failure. And I'd come to believe that I couldn't get sober because I had tried and tried. But I had tried, but I had not surrendered. And so there's a bit difference with that. And that's what it took for me. And I did exactly what she said. And I had a real powerful experience there. And honestly, like I was so broken. I mean, I think if they told me like to wear a yellow polka dot bikini to group every day, I would have done it. You know what I mean? Like I was just so tired and so broken, and I was tired of disappointing, family, career, like bosses, all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to change, and I was ready to change.
What was if you don't mind sharing, obviously it took you a long time to get sober, what was the
Mhm.
trigger to put you back to drinking? Like when you probably were maybe sober for a
Yeah.
couple of days or a week or two or whatever.
Yeah.
What was the trigger for you, or what has been? Have you
Yeah, I mean,
figured it out?
yeah, trigger's a hard word to really identify because some people mean different things by it than others. But what I will say is I needed I needed something in addition to just not physically having alcohol in my body. I needed sort of this, this spiritual turning point where the other centeredness started to be the focus of my life versus, the self-centeredness that had kind of, dominated me for a long time. And when I say self-centeredness, I don't mean that as arrogance. I don't even mean that as like stinginess. I don't mean it like that. I mean like being overly focused on what's going on with me as a result of what's happening like outside of me. I don't think I'm doing a good job of explaining that, but it's almost like seeing everything through the lens of how does it affect me versus what can I give back to the universe? Who can I help today? What can I do that would be, a very sort of something to give back to, like they say, are you in the stream of life, meaning like are you showing up for your responsibilities, are you doing these outwardly focused things? So for me, I had to have that, which is sort of the spiritual program of action, which I call recovery. I had to have that as well as no substance in my body, because if it was just no substance in my body and I didn't have sort of these other spiritual tools that I ended up learning in recovery, it just fell short every time. And I wanted to change the way that I felt. It doesn't matter really if I was sad or happy or, celebrating or, crying in my Cheerios. Whenever I felt bad, it was like this, like I said, this his prehistoric part of my brain, knew one way for me to feel better. And that was through substances.
Mm.
And it just was a merry-go-round in a way. It just went on and on and on and on to the point where I was really taught how to live a life in recovery because it wasn't something that came very naturally to me.
It's like you're learning
And
a new habit, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly, exactly. And I also learned that, my family had struggled for generations with alcoholism. And that was something in the deep South. I'm from South Georgia, and you don't air your dirty laundry. That was like, what we all grew up with. And to the point that we didn't air it at all. We didn't even talk about it inside our house. So when I began to sort of put all those pieces together, it made sense to me of why I struggled as long and hard as I did.
well, so, and that's what I want to ask you, because we've touched on it a couple times, right? This is generational.
Mhm,
Obviously, it's happened for a lot in your family. So the statistics would show
mhm,
you have kids,
mhm.
right? How do you
Yeah.
talk to your kids about this?
Honestly, that's one of the things I'm most proud of because my older three kids, my husband and I've been married for 22 years now, and I have three kids from my first marriage. He has one from his first marriage, and we have one together. So the three kids that are from my first marriage was with my college drinking buddy, like I said. And I just told them their whole life about genetics, and they watched me, right? I mean, they watched that struggle. They lived that struggle with me because they were in, middle school and in high school, and it was really hard on them. But the thing I'm really proud of is because they saw my struggles and they saw me not give up, all three of them now, one's 32, one's 31, and one's 28, they're all in recovery. And that's because they had the language of my home is recovery language, right? We talk about God, we talk about helping others, we talk about, um, character assets and defects and stuff like that. And so when they started to struggle, they had the language to ask for help, a good decade, almost a decade and a half before I did in my own life, because they have been introduced to this world where recovery is not only okay, but it's, life changing in the very best way. And so I feel like even though they suffered some trauma and stuff because of my alcoholism, absolutely no doubt about it, but they also got the message loud and clear that recovery is possible.
Yeah. That's always, I always, when I have a 10-year-old, and I
Yeah.
always wonder like the convert, because I haven't, again, fortunately, I haven't gone through any of that. So
Yeah.
that's something, how do I have the conversation with him?
Mm,
Do I have the conversation? You know, like those are type of things that
mhm.
you always try to figure out. I guess as a parent, you want to do the best you can and you want to share,
Right.
you know, because I think growing up, probably maybe similar to you, I don't know, like growing up, it was like, we don't talk about anything.
Nothing.
We don't talk about anything. Put it aside. It's not, sweep it on the rug. Now I think, you know, folks are realizing like, no, let's have, like, one thing I'm very grateful for is I have so much open dialogue with my son. I mean, we talk
Yeah.
about everything, which
Yeah.
is cool, but it's like, okay, what should, do I have
Yeah.
to,
Like,
like,
where's the
yeah,
line, right?
yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know. So that's why I figured to ask if there was anything specific, and maybe you're seeing in the treatment care centers, maybe if there's kids that are
Yeah.
coming in or teenagers coming in, how do you talk?
Absolutely. And it's not only addiction that the younger kids are coming in with now. It's the level of trauma is unbelievable. A lot of that is because the opiate epidemic, right? Because, I drank for all through college and law school in my 20s and half my 30s, but um I didn't have friends die of overdose. It wasn't like your five best friends that you grew up with, three of them are dead and two are in jail because of opiates and fentanyl. And that is the norm now, right? And I remember I was doing like a process group. This was maybe like 4 or 5 years ago with some clients. And I just sort of made a mental note. Like I looked around the circle and there were 6 guys in the circle with me. And every single one of them had lost either a family member or a close friend to overdose and death within the last 12 months. And just think about that. Like that is talk about triggering abandonment issues and, not being able to, trust God or your higher power, the universe or whatever you want to call it. And so it's been a lot harder. And you know what I tell my son, my youngest son now is 18, and I tell him, I don't take anything. And I hate to say that because, I think everybody deserves an opportunity to go to college and kind of sow their oats or whatever. But fentanyl is in everything these days. And you cannot predict what it's going to be and what it's not going to be. And we've had kids come into the treatment center that all that they were doing was smoking weed and it was laced with fentanyl. And some of them lived through it and some of them didn't. But either way, they were introduced to this very, very, very toxic, dangerous, and addictive substance. And this is probably like a non-politically correct thing to say, but, back in the day when I was buying weed or even, cocaine or whatever, the thought never occurred to me that this was going to kill me. But that's what you have to think about today. And I don't understand it. I don't know enough to really speak intelligently about how all that has happened. And honestly, I don't think that we will have that real answers probably for 10 to 20 years, just based on US news cycles, et cetera. But it's terrifying now. And it's like, it's as a parent, it scares the hell out of me. It really does.
Yeah. Well, so then what are you hopeful with? So obviously Foundation Stone, and now your first location's just launching or did launch, or right?
Today is the
Oh,
first
today.
day. Today's the
Oh,
day.
wow. Big day.
Yeah. So Foundation Stone is like the parent company because I'm going to do a few programs that I have in my mind and heart. And the first one is a primary mental health program here in Austin. It's called Amend Wellness. And I'm really excited about it. It's the first primary mental health program that I've done, but it's also combined with a lot of integrative and functional medicine. So if you think of, like Western tradition for mental health is like a psychiatrist and a prescription.
Mhm.
And then Eastern might be, so many hours in the sunlight, cold plunge, infrared sauna, acupuncture, whatever it is. So we've got a lot of those kind of activities going on too. Really just trying to help people understand, their diagnosis and understand the things that they can incorporate into their life that aren't necessarily medications, that can really help them to take charge of their diagnosis and realize that their diagnosis is not the definition of them, and to be really confident about how to, live with an illness, and not unlike alcoholism, right? I had to learn. I had to learn how to do that.
Yeah. What how are you setting up these treatment centers? Anything, again, going back to your relationship with them when you were in,
Mhm.
like anything different, like you've changed, anything you've kept where you're like, wow, this really worked. I want to make sure this is,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I'm considered the founder of BRC. It is BRC Healthcare now. It was BRC Family of Programs. And I, with a great team, built those companies. And we had the BRC programs, and we had a young adult program, and then we had a trauma program. So some of the lessons that I learned along the way there were to, I believe in my focus, and my my goal is to have smaller programs, like niche or boutique programs that address specific things, because I think that treatment is just like anything else, right? If you go somewhere and they tell you, like they do it all, they treat it all, then they probably don't treat much, right? But if you go to a place where there's experts who are dedicated to mental health, or dedicated to young adult treatment, or dedicated to a trauma focused program. And so that's really my goal, is to continue this this, I guess, would be sort of like the second platform of programs I will have built once it's off the ground, and just to continue to really specialize in things, because then you put yourself in a position with the right staff and the right location and ambiance and programs, et cetera, to really help a specific subset of people. And that's what I do.
That sounds like a great endeavor for sure.
Yeah. The second one that's going to be under Foundation Stone is going to be a women's only program. I can't tell you much about it except for that. And it's probably going to open late summer. I'm really excited about that, because that's where, I shared before, that's where my journey in this industry started. And I love to help women, because I understand the specific challenges. And like I said before, all the shame of, being a mom and not being able to be there to take care of, all those things that women, take on themselves historically. I'm excited about that program. And then I have another idea, but I'm not sure if I'm going to go forward with that one. So I'll have to come back to you and
yeah, there we go.
fill you in later.
Part two.
That's right. That's right.
Well, for this conversation, anything you would share, whether it's around getting started, it could be businesses, it could be just self-improvement, whatever, anything you would leave the audience with, any last thoughts or comments?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I love your podcast. Thank you for having me. And I love your mission. And what I would say, one of the things I say is I build to the need, meaning that I pay attention to what's happening around me. How do you get an idea to do a mental health program? Well, I've had this client and this client and this client, and they've struggled with this, and I didn't have the answers, and here's why. So I think, number one, without going into too much detail, pay attention, right, to your field and whatever it is that you're in. Number two would be to create a team around you, and don't be afraid if they're smarter than you or know more than you do about something. Have the humility and the courage to employ really smart people and listen to them. And number three is just to know deep down within yourself that you have everything that it takes to create or to complete the mission that your higher power has put in front of you. I remember one time, this is sort of a weird thing to say, but I'm a Beyonce fan. And I went to a Beyonce concert maybe like 6-7 years ago now. And at one point during the performance, it was in Atlanta, and she stopped everything. Everything was quiet and the musicians were quiet. And she said essentially what I just said, which is, I want to tell you something. Everything that you need to create happiness and success in your life is within you right now. It's a matter of you trusting yourself, and you're listening to your own intuition, and you can have and you can be anything that you can dream of. And I was like, I mean, hello, if Beyonce says that, it must be true. So, and I mean, I'm sort of being silly right now, but the truth is that's how I felt. And she said it. And now it's become a part of my, my sort of, toolkit in a way. I can remind myself, you can do it. And if I'm talking to you or anybody else, it's like, if you can think it, you can do it. And there's only one you, and there's only one version of you that we need. And so when ideas or, just something exciting that passes your mind, if you asked, 3 or 4 people, they might all say, no, you can never do that. Don't talk to them. Know that you can do it, and know that you have the tools, the mindset, the heart, and the energy and enthusiasm and the grit to get it done.
Yeah. That's a great way to end our conversation, Marsha. Where can everyone say hello to you? Do you hang out in any social watering holes at all? Or
Well, I have LinkedIn, Marsha Stone. I have Facebook, Instagram, and I have a website, marshastone.com.
Perfect.
And if you want to send me an email, it's very hard to remember, marsha@marshastone.com. But I love to talk to people and just be helpful however I can. And I'm just really grateful to be sitting here today talking about, what it's like to be able to overcome struggles, and what it's like to be able to build something that, your heart has dreamed about. And I will say, if I can do it, anybody can do it, because there was many, many times in my life where people that knew me pretty well had pretty much written me off.
Yeah.
And just don't stop. Just don't stop.
Well, I appreciate the vulnerability, and it definitely helps. I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people hearing your message, your story. So thank you again.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me and being willing to listen. I think it starts with conversations like this.